Well, thank you so much, Wade. That was really great, and I'm happy to invite you on for some Q&A. Welcome, Wade Davis.
Thanks, Andrew.
We're pre-recording some of this Q&A because you might be heading off on another expedition. Is that right?
Yeah, I just don't know where I'm going to be on June 29th. We've been in Canada, we've been very restricted. I haven't left this little island virtually, except to go skiing a few times since the COVID thing struck.
This talk is really important to me because I actually, my mother was an anthropologist, and I got into design kind of as a way of kind of doing anthropology, and what was very frustrating to me is I went to a university so I could take university classes along with design classes, and then when I took anthropology, it was all about self-reflection of the field rather than the work, and so I basically just didn't do it, and it was very frustrating. And so this really resonates with me, and I'm wondering, is there a generation of either explorers or storytellers or even anthropologists, grad students that are willing to go to the field, or are you seeing that's just drying out?
No, absolutely. But they're, in many cases their work is not being supported by the funding agencies that are controlled by this orthodoxy. There's never been more a stronger cadre of imaginative explorers than the millennial generation. Part of this for me is that when I, turned my back on academic life, it didn't mean that I stopped being an academic. Every one of my books, I've written 23, is a PhD. For my book on Everest, I bought 600 books, visited 57 archives, made 3 field expeditions to the flanks of Everest and spent months in monasteries. The point is, you continue to do the ethnographic work. It's just that you publish in outlets that are accessible to people and meaningful to people. Look, we live in a time where, according to a study of Derek Bach, fully 98% of academic papers in the humanities and 75% in the social sciences are never cited again. Never cited once. Well, that's a measure of their relevance. Right. We live in a world where at a major university, like University of British Columbia, where I'm on the faculty, something on the order of 70% of our successful PhDs do not get academic jobs. And yet the pedagogy is still based on a calcified 1960s model that said that if you got a PhD, you became a professor. And so what have we done? The number of PhDs being produced is soaring, the number of tenured positions is dropping, and the number of sessional employees, in some cases, poor men and women living in the backs of cars, being paid pittances to do coursework for classes full of students whose parents are paying huge amounts of money in tuition to support that university. We watch at universities where the percentage of the budget committed to administration is soaring, whereas that to pedagogy and teaching is declining. You see that these universities are frankly working their way out of relevance.
And you touched on this a little bit, is that this massive, wild kind of human experiment that we're in the middle of right now, COVID. And I'd love to just get you touched on it in your essay, but what is anthropology? Where does it fit into an amazing kind of time that we are in? Amazing in the sense it's kind of horrible, but amazing.
Never in history has the entire world focused on the same problem. A pathogen 10,000 times smaller than a grain of salt, which not only commandeered our biology, but attacked the network of community and connectivity that is for a social species what teeth and claws represent to the tiger. We saw the world shut down, but also in that vision we saw what the world is. One of the extraordinary things about COVID is that we saw the resilience of the earth. Overnight the skies clearing over Kathmandu and Delhi and Mumbai for the first time in a generation. Wild boar in the streets of Barcelona, wolves and grizzlies in the floor of Yosemite, the canals of Venice clear, rivers in Colombia running like brook streams. I found that really inspiring and humbling. And also it showed the impact of human activities on the earth, of course. But it's humbling to remember, Xander, that if you took the entire hominid presence on Earth, I don't just mean Homo sapiens and going back to our immediate progenitor Homo erectus, but all the way back to Homo afarensis, which is somewhere 2.3 million years ago, and you take that entire timeline and put it on a 24-hour clock of the history of the Earth, the entire hominid presence would not occupy a second. So in other words, the weed will win in the end, as that great Sierra Club book said. The question is, will we leave to our descendants an Earth that we can be proud of? And I think COVID, many things will change coming out of COVID. I think we've discovered that people can work in a digital age at home. Not all peoples, and certainly not people who have to scramble for a living every day on the streets of cities like Medellin and Lima and Mumbai. But certainly a number of us can. And I think we can look back also at the frenetic travel schedules that we all once had as a kind of violent hallucination. I never want to have to travel like that again. It doesn't mean I won't travel for purpose and for meaningful experiences, and I hope we all do more of that. But that image we all have of Chicago's O'Hare Airport on Monday afternoon, like ants in an ant nest, right? I think some of that's got to, what manager can rationalize the expense of flying in the executive team to San Francisco and putting them up in the W Hotel and all that kind of racket, So I think
or people getting flown around the world for a 45-minute talk.
Well, that's right. And that's what I used to do. I'd fly off to Cleveland to the Ball Bearing Manufacturers Association. And now, of course, I've found that this new world of Zoom has been so liberating for me. Now, I don't want to in any way state the sadness and the misery we feel for those who have suffered, not just who have lost loved ones, but the economic dislocations. I'm lucky enough to be in a place where I didn't have economic pressures. I live in a place that's beautiful and bucolic, and it was a pleasant place to sit out the pandemic. So I'm not trying to say that I wasn't very much a person of privilege in that. But at the same time, I remember I woke up one morning and I edited with that Rolling Stone piece, edited another piece I was doing for a publisher in Toronto, participated in the Sonoma Writers Festival, a wonderful festival that I didn't have to go to. I could just, and that had 4,000 people instead of 400 people. Then I administered an exam to a kid in Singapore, got it back, graded it, put it into the registrar at the university, looked at my watch, Xander, it was 11 o'clock, and I went out and planted a fruit orchard. I think we can find ways to, I hope we'll learn from our year of quietude.
And I want to come back to this thing that you mentioned in your talk, this kind of nexus of where cultural and linguistic loss is often a precursor to massive environmental loss. And I think, there's this, as you were mentioning, as we lose language after language, and we lose the indigenous people lose the words for the things around them, that also seems to presage them losing the care for a lot of the things around them and moving away from their ancestral areas. And so I think this is it's rare that you have a signal where you can get a 20-year head start knowing that the environmental loss is going to happen in a place. And that's one of the kind of signals that that this kind of information gives us, but we don't seem to be acting on it in a very good way.
People are recognizing that much of the, at least terrestrial extant biodiversity, pristine lands, is at least titularly under the control of indigenous people. And so, for example, my good friend Pete Seligman, who created Conservation International, now is with the support of the Emerson Collective. He's got a new organization, Neotero, which is trying to work directly with indigenous people as colleagues to empower them to be stronger and more forceful and more empowered advocates of their own homelands. And that kind of combination of environmental vision, of which Pete personifies, particularly in the tropics, with the support for indigenous people, was almost unimaginable in the year, for example, when Pete and Russ Mittermeier and others came together to create CI. So I think that's all very positive. And again, indigenous people when it's a little bit like the environment. I think we're impatient with the pace of social change. But when I was a kid, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. Nobody spoke about the biosphere. Now that term is part of the vernacular of school children. And by the same token, when I first went to Colombia in 1974, for example, and I'd say to my friends, the parents of my friends in particular at the Nacional, the university, that I was going to live with the Arahuacos in the Sierra Nevada, they would say to me, ¿por qué quiere vivir con la gente sucia? Why do you want to live with the dirty people? Well, there have now been 5 Colombian presidents whose first act of office, even before their inauguration, has been to go to the Sierra to pay homage to the Mamos who have emerged kind of symbols of continuity and hope in a country that's been torn by the drug wars. There's much progress to be made, but we've come, in a sense, a very long way. And it's an ongoing, again, as I said earlier, there's not a clear victory line or an ending line. It's just a process we have to continue to do. The idea that nations in Canada treat nation to nation with the federal government would have been unimaginable in the lifetime of my grandfather. But now it's something that not only occurs, it's broadly supported by the Canadian people. And we're proud of it.
Well, and we're going to wrap up here a little bit. I just wanted to get a sense of what is next for you as the pandemic lifts. I know your most recent book was just out this fall about the river in Colombia. And what's your next project?
Well, my real devotion is to Colombia, where I was made an honorary citizen by the Nobel laureate Juan Manuel Santos, who's become a good friend. The book I wrote, Magdalena, River of Dreams, is really an attempt to write a biography of a country through the metaphor of its Mississippi, if you will, the Magdalena, the river of life, the river that made possible the country. Colombia is a gift of the river. And the book was conceived in a moment of great optimism, in a sense, written over 5 years, sparked in part. I was there during the historic signing of the peace agreement. And because of the success of other books that I've had, the book El Rio, for example, which was published in Colombia in 2002, a low point in the country's fortunes, and it became not just a hit book, but a kind of a map of dreams for generations of kids who couldn't travel within their own country. And it was embraced by all sides of the Colombian spectrum, old and young, left and right. And it was actually named by the Biblioteca Nacional as one of the first 25 of what will be the top 200 books in the history of the country, which was a singular kind of honor. And because of that book and films I've done, positions I've had, speeches I've given, the new book, I have a voice in Colombia that is something that I have to use effectively and humbly. And now my question is how to use it in the wake of the recent disturbances that have racked the country. It's a very sad situation that I think the world needs to understand. I mean, let's just remember that 260,000 dead, 100,000 missing, 7 million internally displaced, 5 million forced to flee. How would the United States feel if Canada had patterns of drug consumption, laws that did nothing to limit the trade but empowered the cartels, such that 85 million Americans would be forced from their homes? Well, that's what happened in Colombia. And yet during all those terrible years of a war that would not have lasted a day without the cocaine money. Last year of war, incidentally, the FARC made $600 million from kidnapping, extortion, and drug trafficking. Give me the Boy Scouts of San Francisco, of Marin County, and $600 million. I can create havoc in Northern California. During all those years, Colombia maintained civil society, democracy, greened its cities, sought restitution with indigenous people, as I've mentioned, created millions of acres of national parks, and paved the way for a cultural, economic renaissance as 2 generations of kids forced to flee are coming home with skill sets and everywhere. But here's where things went wrong. Santos negotiated the peace agreement. The peace agreement had clauses that would cost $45 billion, mostly about social development, infrastructure development. Then into office came Duque, a protege of Alvaro Uribe, who ran against the agreement. And if he didn't actively dismantle it, he certainly did little to implement it. And he didn't have the gravitas himself that a Santos, who had just electrified the world by winning the Peace Prize, would have had, say he had had a few extra years in office. And because of that, into the void created by the retreat of the FARC and the failure of the federal state to entered into that area dissidents, cartels. Remember, we've continued, until we do the cleansing stroke of legalization, cocaine will be the curse of Colombia. The rivers of blood will still flow because of cocaine. And then on top of everything, faced with the expenses of implementing the accord, the price of oil collapsed, Colombia's main source of foreign revenue, and then Colombia did something it hasn't gotten credit for it. The biggest humanitarian crisis in the history of the Americas had 2 million Venezuelans come into Colombia, and they weren't rejected at the border as America rejects people from Central America. They were welcomed, housed, fed, schooled, given health care, and given permission to work. And then comes COVID. The economic collapse, the social collapse, poverty rates increase after having gone down for years, and then comes together a kind of a perfect storm. An ill-conceived tax proposed that's going to that people just don't want to hear about in their time of economic need and misery. Various students with their grievances, indigenous people with their grievances, and again, it's like Black Lives Matter. It explodes in the streets. It doesn't necessarily mean that America should be measured exclusively by what happened in the summer of Black Lives Matter, for all that we need to recall and acknowledge that wonderful phrase. But so what's happening now is sort of this perfect storm, and then it's been accentuated by some police brutality, and 40 or 50 at least people have been shot unnecessarily, mostly young kids. And again, what we forget is that the police, part of the Department of Defense, they're all coming out of a 50-year conflict where Escobar, in the very beginning, made murder and death cheap, right? So, I'm not saying that the police should be forgiven. On the contrary, but you're talking about security forces that have been living through all their lives a world of violence, of a three-sided war that saw 260,000 people killed, all because of North American and European consumption of cocaine, I might add. Right. And so it's just broken like a storm, and it's not going to put Colombia back to where it was. Peace will never disappear. The people are too hungry for it, and there is a middle way in Colombia, and that middle way is what I represent. And it's a place that I want to speak from. And so my biggest effort in the next months will be doing everything I can for Colombia in the peace process.
Well, thank you so much for this talk, and thank you so much for joining us. And can't wait to hear how it goes in the coming months in Colombia. I hope you're able to get back soon.
Thanks very much, Xander.
And I want to thank you, our audience with Long Now. We look forward to having you at our future talks. Thank you.